The rain in this part of the city doesn't wash things clean. It just makes the grime look permanent. Zariah Vale navigated the neon-blurred shadows of the backstreets, her oversized gray hoodie heavy with moisture, and her eyes scanning for a dry place to rest. She was a ghost in the machine of the city, a young woman living on the fringes where mercy was a luxury no one could afford. Then she saw him. He looked like a discarded shell of a man, slumped on a wet curb with his dark hair plastered to his forehead. To Zariah, he was just another soul drowned by the concrete, another victim of a city that took everything and gave nothing back. She didn't see the lethal, analytical glint in his eyes or the serpentine ink coiling up his neck beneath the collar of his rugged jacket. She didn't see Seo Jin-Wook, the viper of the soul-based syndicate, who had just been left for dead in a bloody coup. Moving with a cautious, sincere grace, Zariah leaned forward, extending a hand that trembled only slightly from the cold. She offered him the only treasure she had, a safe place to hide. "You can stay here tonight," she whispered. Jin-Wook looked up, and for the first time in a decade, the viper was struck silent, not by a bullet, but by a mercy he didn't buy. Zariah's apartment was less of a home and more of a fortress built from leftovers. It was a single, cramped room tucked into the attic of a building the city had forgotten to tear down. The air smelled of old wood, rain, and the faint, sweet scent of the cheap jasmine tea she brewed on a hot plate. For Seo Jin-Wook, a man whose previous bathroom was larger than this entire living space, the atmosphere was suffocating. He sat on the edge of a bed that creaked under his weight, his broad shoulders tensed as if expecting the ceiling to collapse. The viper of soul, a man who had dictated the flow of billions, was now surrounded by mismatched plates and a window sealed with duct tape. Every time his gaze landed on a cracked mug or the frayed edges of the single rug, a flare of indignity burned in his chest. It was a physical itch, a primal rejection of the lack of power this room represented. "It isn't much," Zariah said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. She didn't sound apologetic, she sounded matter-of-fact. She moved with a practiced, economical grace, hanging her damp hoodie on a peg and checking a small pot on the stove. "But the heater works if you give it a kick, and the locks are better than they look." Jin-Wook watched her. In the dim, amber light of a solitary lamp, she didn't look like a victim of the streets. She moved with an unshakable resilience that fascinated him. She had nothing, not even a full set of cutlery, yet she moved through her space with the quiet confidence of a queen in a palace. There was no shame in her eyes, only the hard-won pride of someone who had looked at the abyss and refused to blink. "Why?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that felt too large for the room. Zariah paused, a ladle in her hand. She looked at him, really looked at him, not seeing the dangerous ink on his neck or the lethal potential in his hands, but the exhaustion etched into his face. "Because it's cold out there," she said simply, "and no one should have to disappear in the rain." Jin-Wook looked away, his jaw tightening. He was used to loyalty bought with fear or gold. This unsolicited sanctuary, was a currency he didn't know how to spend. As he watched her meticulously divide a meager portion of stew, ensuring he had the larger share, the indignity of his poverty began to shift. It was replaced by a dangerous, burgeoning curiosity. He had been betrayed by those he clothed in silk, yet he was being fed by a woman who barely had enough for herself. The viper was resting, but as he watched Zariah Vale, he realized he wasn't just hiding. He was learning a new kind of power, the kind that didn't need a throne to rule. The rain continued to lash against the attic window, a rhythmic drumming that usually lulled Zariah to sleep, but tonight felt like a warning. Jin-Wook had finally shed his soaked, grime-caked outer jacket, sitting in a threadbare t-shirt that stretched across his powerful frame. The air in the small room had grown thick, charged with the proximity of two strangers sharing a space designed for one. Zariah moved toward him, a thick hand-knitted blanket draped over her arms. "You're still shivering," she murmured, her voice soft in the dim light. As she leaned in to drape the wool over his shoulders, the oversized sleeve of her hoodie caught on his shoulder, pulling back. In that breath of shared warmth, the amber glow of the lamp hit his skin. Zariah froze. Emerging from the collar of his shirt and coiling upward toward his jaw was a masterpiece of shadow and ink. It wasn't the crude, blurred marking of a street gang. It was a serpent, intricate and menacing, with scales that seemed to shimmer in the low light. It was the mark of the viper, a symbol of authority and lethality that belonged to a world of blood and silk, not hunger and rain. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked from the tattoo to his eyes, intense, ancient, and suddenly very sharp. He wasn't just a man who had lost his way. He was a predator who had merely lost his throne. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't brought home a victim. She had invited a storm into her sanctuary. "Zariah," he began, his voice dropping to a low, warning vibration. He reached out not to strike, but to steady her trembling hand. But the moment of revelation was cut short by a sound that didn't belong in the attic, the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots on the rotting wooden stairs outside. The floorboards groaned under a weight that wasn't the wind. Jin-Wook's entire demeanor shifted in a heartbeat. The vulnerability disappeared, replaced by a terrifying, surgical precision. He lunged upward, blowing out the lamp with a sharp breath and pulling Zariah into the deepest shadow beside the wardrobe. His hand, calloused and firm, pressed gently but firmly over her mouth. The world went black, save for the blue flicker of lightning through the duct-taped window. Through the thin wood of the door, a muffled voice crackled on a radio, a professional, cold sound that signaled the end of their quiet night. The danger hadn't just arrived. It was breathing on the other side of the lock. "Stay behind me," he whispered into her ear, his breath hot against her skin. The beggar was gone. The viper had returned. The week that followed was lived in the blue-gray smudge of dawn and the flickering neon of the street below. Jin-Wook remained a shadow within Zariah's attic by day, but the room had begun to change. He no longer sat like a guest awaiting execution. He moved with the quiet, territorial precision of a man rebuilding a base of operations. While Zariah was away at her grueling shifts, he didn't just wait. He observed. From the duct-taped window, he watched the ecosystem of the alleyway. He saw the way the local crew, petty thugs who wore their cruelty like cheap cologne, cornered Zariah as she returned home, laughing as they pulled at her hood or made her stumble. He saw her head remain low, her shoulders tight with a practiced, weary endurance. To them, she was a ghost to be bullied. To Jin-Wook, she was the person who had fed the viper when his own blood had left him to starve. The first night he slipped out, the rain was a heavy curtain that muffled the sound of snapping bone. The two men who usually sat on the stoop, demanding tribute from Zariah's meager tips, never saw the man in the dark hoodie coming. Jin-Wook didn't use a gun. That was too loud, too impersonal. He used the terrifying, efficient violence of a professional who knew exactly where the human body was weakest. He left them crumpled in the trash, alive but possessed by a new, shivering fear of the dark. Within 3 days, the neighborhood changed. The loiterers vanished. The catcalls stopped. Zariah noticed the silence first, a strange, heavy peace that followed her from the bus stop to her door. She looked at Jin-Wook when she returned, seeing the fresh bruising on his knuckles and the cold, flat stillness in his eyes. She didn't ask, and he didn't offer. In this world, some gifts were better left unacknowledged. But silence in a city like this was never truly empty. By the 5th night, a sleek black sedan, too expensive for the cracked asphalt of Zariah's street, began to cruise the perimeter. The Viper's signature was unmistakable to those who knew how to read the violence of the streets. Jin-Wook had cleared the path for Zariah, but in doing so, he had lit a flare in the darkness. As the neon "vacancy" sign across the street buzzed and died, Jin-Wook stood in the shadows of the attic, watching the sedan stop. The local thugs were gone, but the real monsters had finally seen a ghost they recognized. He turned to Zariah, who was setting out 2 chipped plates, and realized that his attempt to protect her sanctuary had just painted a target on the only door that had ever opened for him. The candlelight flickered between them, casting long, jagged shadows against the peeling wallpaper of the attic. The silence in the room had changed. It was no longer the quiet of 2 strangers sharing a roof, but the heavy, suffocating stillness that precedes a landslide. Jin-Wook sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped tightly, the serpentine ink on his neck seeming to writhe in the dancing light. "You've noticed the change in the streets," he began, his voice dropping into a low, resonant frequency that vibrated in the small space. "The silence out there, It isn't peace. It's a vacuum, and it's about to be filled. Zariah sat across from him on a milk crate, her fingers tracing the rim of a chipped mug. She didn't blink. She had seen the bruises on his knuckles and the way he watched the door like a soldier in a trench. "Who are you, really?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jin-Wook looked up, his eyes two shards of flint. "In the world I come from, they call me the Viper. I sat at the head of the Soul Syndicate, commanding a throne built on blood and absolute loyalty. Or so I thought." He let out a harsh, self-deprecating laugh. "My own inner circle, men I called brothers, decided I had grown too soft. They staged a coup, slaughtered my loyalists, and left me for dead in that rain where you found me. They think the Viper is buried, but I am merely molting." Zariah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty window. She was a girl who struggled to pay for electricity, now sitting feet away from a man who had ruled an underworld empire. The danger she had sensed wasn't just a shadow, it was a living, breathing predator. "They are coming, Zariah," he continued, leaning forward into the light. "The sedan downstairs, it's a scout. When the sun goes down tomorrow, this attic will no longer be a sanctuary, it will be a kill zone." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small roll of crumpled bills, the last of his hidden reserves. He pushed it across the table toward her. "Take this. Leave tonight. Go to the bus station, head south, and don't look back. You saved my life, and this is the only way I can save yours." Zariah looked down at the money, then back at the man who had gone from a broken stranger to a lethal king in the span of a week. She thought of the thugs he had cleared away, the quiet dignity he had shown in her poverty, and the way his presence had made her feel seen in a city that made her invisible. "No," she said, her voice small but anchored with a sudden, fierce weight. Jin-Wook's brow furrowed. "You don't understand. These people don't leave witnesses. If you stay, you die." "I've been dying in this city for years, Jin-Wook," she replied, reaching across the table to push the money back toward him. She didn't pull her hand away when it brushed his. "Everyone else walked past you. I didn't. I'm not starting now." In the dim light, the Viper's mask faltered. For a fleeting second, the ruthless boss was gone, replaced by a man who was genuinely, deeply stunned. He took her hand, his grip firm and warm, a silent vow forming in the dark between the girl who had nothing and the king who had lost everything. The silence of the attic didn't break. It shattered. One moment, the only sound was the low hum of the dying candle. The next, the door exploded inward in a spray of splintered wood and twisted metal. Zariah didn't even have time to scream before a heavy, powerful hand clamped onto her shoulder, yanking her behind the solid mass of the wardrobe, just as a muffled thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire peppered the space where she had been standing seconds before. The man who had sat humbly on her floor for a week was gone. In his place stood a nightmare carved from shadow. Jin-Wook didn't move like a person. He moved like a glitch in reality, a blur of lethal intent. As the first intruder stepped through the threshold, Jin-Wook didn't reach for a weapon. He became one. With a terrifying, surgical precision, he closed the distance in a single stride, his hand catching the gunman's wrist with a sickening crack. In a fluid motion that looked more like a dark dance than a fight, he used the man's own momentum to drive him into the wall, disarming him before the body even hit the floor. Zariah watched, paralyzed, as the Viper truly uncoiled. There was no hesitation in him, no wasted breath. When the second assassin lunged, Jin-Wook met him midair, a devastating strike to the throat silencing the man instantly. The room, once her sanctuary, was now a jagged landscape of violence. The air tasted of ozone and copper. Through the chaos, she saw Jin-Wook's face. It wasn't angry. It was cold. It was a mask of absolute. Terrifying competence that made her realize the man she had fed was capable of horrors she couldn't imagine. The third gunman fired wildly, the bullets shredding Zariah's hand-knitted blankets and shattering the jasmine teapot. Jin-Wook didn't flinch. He used a fallen chair as a shield, closing the gap with a predatory speed that defied the cramped dimensions of the room. A single, sharp crack of bone followed, and then a heavy, final silence. Jin-Wook stood in the center of the wreckage, his chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm. He didn't look at the fallen men. His eyes immediately found Zariah in the shadows. The transition was jarring. The lethal stillness in his gaze flickered, softening for a fraction of a second as he checked her for injuries. "I told you the storm would come," he said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. He held out his hand, his knuckles split and bleeding, but his grip as steady as stone. The glass was shattered, her secret life was over, and the humble attic was now a tomb. "Now we stop hiding." The transition from the attic to the street was a descent into a world that belonged to Zariah, not the Viper. As they moved through the labyrinthine alleyways, the predatory confidence that had defined Jin-Wook in the fight began to bleed away, replaced by the staggering reality of his injuries. The adrenaline was fading, and in its place was the cold, heavy weight of blood loss. He stumbled, his shoulder clipping a brick wall, and for the first time, the Iron King looked small against the backdrop of the towering city. Zariah didn't hesitate. She stepped into his space, hooking his heavy arm over her shoulders and bracing her feet against the slick pavement. "This way," she hissed, guiding him not toward the main roads where the black sedans prowled, but toward a narrow gap between two derelict warehouses. In the glittering high-rises of the Pinnacle, Jin-Wook knew how to navigate boardrooms and bulletproof motorcades. But down here, in the veins of the city where the light didn't reach, he was a tourist. He watched, dazed, as Zariah navigated by the smell of the damp air and the specific hum of the subway lines beneath their feet. She knew which gates were rusted shut and which vents exhaled warm air. She knew that a pile of discarded crates wasn't trash, but a ladder to a rooftop path that bypassed the security cameras on the corner. The power dynamic had shifted in the span of a heartbeat. Jin-Wook, who had spent a decade commanding thousands, was now entirely dependent on a girl who knew how to disappear. "Wait," she whispered, pulling him into the shadow of a steam pipe as a police cruiser glided by on the street above. She pressed her back against the warm metal, her eyes darting with a feral intelligence. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was hunting for a path. "If we go to a hospital, they'll find you in 10 minutes. My friend has a stash of supplies in the tunnels near the old shipyard. It's dry, and no one goes there because of the steam leaks." Jin-Wook looked at her, his vision blurring. He saw the way she read the shadows, the way she heard the city's heartbeat and predicted its movements. He had called her weak, a mercy he didn't buy, yet here she was, his only lifeline. "You're a ghost, Zariah," he rasped, his voice thick with pain. "In this city, being a ghost is the only way to stay alive," she replied, her grip on his waist tightening. She didn't look back at the life she had lost in the attic. She only looked forward into the neon-streaked dark, leading the most dangerous man in Seoul through the only kingdom she had ever ruled. The transition from the grime of the tunnels to the shimmering opulence of the Grand Hyatt's ballroom was a violent shock to the senses. The air here didn't smell of damp concrete or copper. It smelled of expensive lilies and the sterile arrogance of power. Jin-Wook stood in the shadows of the velvet curtains, dressed in a tuxedo that Zariah had secured through a contact in the theater district. He looked like a god of war, returned to his temple, his presence so commanding that even the scar on his brow seemed like a crown. "Remember," he whispered, his hand momentarily resting on Zariah's shoulder. The weight of his touch was the only thing keeping her grounded. "You aren't a girl from the streets tonight. You are the mystery they can't afford to ignore. Give me 5 minutes at the security hub, and the Viper will have his fangs back." Zariah stepped out from the shadows, the borrowed emerald silk gown whispering against the marble floor. The dress was a masterpiece of deception, its deep green hue making her skin glow under the crystal chandeliers. She had spent hours practicing her walk in the tunnels, trading her weary slouch for the poised, dangerous grace Jin-Wook had taught her. As she entered the heart of the gala, the conversation faltered. The coup leaders, men who had built their new empire on Jin-Wook's supposed grave, turned their heads, their predatory eyes narrowing at the unknown woman who moved as if she owned the air they breathed. She moved toward the center of the room, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs, but her face a mask of bored elegance. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, her eyes locking onto the man at the head of the table, the elder who had signed Jin-Wook's death warrant. "Is the celebration always this dull?" she asked, her voice projecting with a quiet, melodic confidence that sliced through the room. The elder smirked, intrigued by the audacity of the stranger. He moved toward her, drawn in by the distraction, just as Jin-Wook had planned. Zariah kept him talking, her street-honed instincts reading his every flinch, her laughter acting as a smokescreen for the silent shadow moving through the rafters above. Across the room, the lights flickered, a subtle rhythmic pulse that only she recognized. It was the signal. The Viper had breached the system. Zariah looked the elder directly in the eye, her smile widening into something sharp and knowing. She was no longer just a girl who had offered a stranger a roof. She was the herald of the storm that was about to break the palace walls. The distraction was over. The reckoning had begun. The gala was a glittering trap, and the teeth finally snapped shut on the helipad of the Pinnacle. The wind up here was a feral beast, howling through the steel girders and whipping the torrential rain into a blinding frenzy. Below them, the city was a blurred grid of indifferent lights, but on this concrete island in the sky, the air tasted of ozone and impending death. Jin-Wook moved through the storm like a wraith reclaimed from the grave. His tuxedo was ruined, soaked through and clinging to his frame, but his eyes held a terrifying, singular focus. Across the rain-slicked expanse stood his brother, the man who had traded blood for a throne that didn't belong to him. Between them, Zariah was a splash of emerald silk against the gray concrete, her hands bound, and a blade held to her throat by the last of the elder's loyalists. "You should have stayed dead, Jin-Wook," his brother roared over the gale, his face contorted by the frantic realization that the Viper had not only survived, but had come for his head. The violence that followed was not the calculated dance of the ballroom. It was a brutal, desperate collision. Jin-Wook tore through the remaining guards with a savagery that made the storm seem tame. He was a force of nature, driven by a decade of cold ambition and a week of newfound warmth. But as he lunged for his brother's throat, a strangled cry pierced the thunder. The guard holding Zariah had lost his footing on the treacherous, wet edge of the helipad. As he tumbled backward into the abyss, he reached out, catching the emerald silk of Zariah's gown. Zariah gasped as she was yanked toward the edge, her boots sliding uselessly on the flooded concrete. She dangled over the 1,000-foot drop, her fingers white as she clung to a rusted railing that groaned under the strain. Jin-Wook froze. His brother lay sprawled at his feet, dazed and defenseless. The killing blow was inches away. He could end the coup, reclaim his empire, and erase the stain of betrayal in a single heartbeat. Or he could turn his back on the throne he had spent his life building. The choice was a jagged blade in his chest. His brother scrambled for a discarded gun, the barrel rising to meet Jin-Wook's heart. But Jin-Wook wasn't looking at the weapon. He was looking at the girl in the emerald dress, the one person who had seen the man behind the Viper. With a guttural roar, Jin-Wook turned away from his brother, launching himself toward the edge. He ignored the searing pain as a bullet grazed his shoulder, his fingers locking around Zariah's wrist with the strength of a titan. He hauled her back from the void, pulling her into his chest as his brother's footsteps retreated into the shadows of the stairwell. The Empire was slipping away, but as Zariah clung to him, shivering and alive, Jin-Wook realized he was no longer a king without a home. He was a man who had finally found something worth more than a crown. The rain hadn't changed, but the glass between Zariah and the storm certainly had. It was thick, reinforced, and polished to a degree that made the outside world look like a high-definition movie rather than a cold reality. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the Pinnacle's penthouse, her feet sinking into a rug that felt like silk and clouds. The oversized gray hoodie was gone, replaced by a robe of heavy black cashmere that draped over her shoulders like a shadow. Behind her, the penthouse was a symphony of quiet power. The scent of old wood and jasmine had been replaced by the sterile, expensive aroma of leather and sandalwood. There were no more creaking floorboards or leaking vents. Here, the air was climate-controlled to a perfect, unchanging warmth. Jin-Wook sat at a desk carved from obsidian, the Viper fully restored to his throne. The rugged canvas jacket had been traded for a charcoal suit so sharp it looked dangerous. He was reading through a digital ledger, his jaw set in that familiar line of granite, but his eyes drifted toward the window every few minutes. He no longer looked like a man drowning on dry land. He looked like the man who owned the water. "You're staring at the clouds again," he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that traveled effortlessly across the vast room. Zariah didn't turn around. She watched the rain lash against the glass, redirected by the wind. Down there in the neon-lit maze of the backstreets, people were currently shivering under bus stops and fighting for dry cardboard. She knew their names. She knew the texture of the hunger they were feeling. "It looks different from up here," she whispered. "It looks small." Jin-Wook rose from the desk, his movements possessing that predatory grace she had first seen in her attic. He stepped up behind her, not touching her, but his heat radiated through the cashmere, creating a solid wall at her back. He looked out at the city, his city, now purged of the traitors who had dared to touch what was his. "It is small," he replied, his gaze intense. "Everything is small compared to what we built in that room, Zariah." He finally reached out, his hand resting firmly on her waist, a possessive, absolute claim. Zariah leaned back into him, the transition complete. She was no longer a ghost in the machine. She was the heart of the Viper's empire. She had traded the freedom of the streets for a cage of gold and glass, a world where she would never be cold or hungry again. But as she looked at her reflection in the darkened window, she saw a woman who had traded her invisibility for a crown of shadows. She wasn't leaving. She was home,